So, welcome to the fifth of six sessions of our spring conferences on creativity. This is the central division of the Societies for the Philosophy of Creativity and the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity, who sponsor our yearly meeting here at the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought. And this year's conference is on the cultural power of personal objects. And I would like to thank the FPC for its generous support of our programming here, and that's a great part of what makes it possible for us to keep doing what we've done. I thank everybody for showing up, and we've had a good time so far and a good time to come. So I'll turn it over to Jared,
right,
my co-organizer, and he'll introduce our speaker.
Our speaker, yes. One of, I guess, first of your two keynotes. You get to be a keynote.
I do?
Yeah, sure.
Well, lots of keynotes.
Lots of keynotes, right? Yeah. And James Mclaughlin is professor of philosophy and religion at Western Carolina University. He is past co-chair of the Mormon Studies Group at the American Academy of Religion and organizer of the Personalist Seminar. He has assisted with him, that's right.
Sorry.
He has assisted as co-chair Levinas Philosophy Summer Seminars in Vilnius, Buffalo, Berkeley, and Rome, and is co-director of the NEH Summer Seminar on Levinas at the University of Buffalo, Summer 2017. His recent publications have dealt with concepts of hell in existentialism, Satan, and demonic evil in Boehme, Schelling, and Dostoevsky, sensing a theme here, and the problem of evil in Mormonism. He is currently working on the study of Levinas and the existentialists, which I believe will be part of your paper today, right?
Yep.
Great.
One thing, the more of this that you folks drink, the better this paper will be. So I'd like to encourage you to all get good and raging drunk. Okay, I want you to think of a scene from a movie. This will come up later. I love spaghetti westerns. And so Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, final shootout scene, Eli Wallach, Lee Van Cleef, and Clint Eastwood standing, corners there, and Sergio Leone hard focusing on the eyes. Okay? So yeah, just bear that in mind. We'll come to it later. Okay, this paper's The Comfort of Things, Personal Objects, Possession, Dwelling, and the Desire to be God in Sartre and Levinas. Introduction. Sartre and Levinas both argue the reality of otherness and of the other as another self-consciousness is immediately available to us. Both are humanists in the French tradition and as such are critical of the tendency toward the personification of things. That things might take on personal characteristics as in cultural traditions. For each, thinking of an object of a person is a mistake, ontologically for Sartre, ethically for Levinas. While each is critical of the personing of things, each would also admit that this is an inevitable result of being in the world of human projects and dwelling. For Levinas, the critique of the personing of things is softened by traditions within Judaism that personify certain Talmudic texts. Levinas will speak of being in the book as an essential element of human existence. But even here, Levinas would only allow this because of the text's relation to human creativity and discursive community that centers around the text. To understand how Sartre and Levinas would approach objects and the personification of objects, it is necessary to examine how each thinks about the human appropriation of things. One of the most interesting comparisons between Sartre and Levinas' description of the relation to the other is that for Sartre, it is a relation to the other that I perceive, it is in my relation to the other that I receive my being, while for Levinas, it is the other who really activates my freedom. For Sartre and Levinas, possession first represents the effort to escape and then to protect the self, from either the positive being in itself, in the positive in itself of being for Sartre, or the anonymous rustling of the there is for Levinas. For both, possession is a defense mechanism against the other who threatens the security of my world. It is in this sense that I might personify an object. I can take I can make it my own while endowing it with a personality that only through self-deception I could see as independent of my will. For Sartre, possession of objects that endows them with our being defends us from the other. It is as we expand ourselves through our bodies to our things. Of course, this is an impossible blending of the in itself and the for itself. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Similar to the projection of human desire that is called God. I labor on things, I create things, I make them my own. While positively things can resist me, resist my will, they do so in a quite different way than does the other. Things make up my surroundings, and I can imagine them that they are my world, a world that in which I can be absorbed. But the other is a hole through which my world is drained, lost in the battle for its meaning. For Levinas, the fathomless obscurity of matter is presented to labor as resistance, not as a face-to-face. The object resists us, but it is not another who resists my appropriation completely. I can use the object, it makes up my surroundings. The creative activity of the human being can pull something out of time into representation. This allows us to elude the irrationality of anonymous being, of the there is, but it also is a challenge of the there is. I'm sorry, I lost it in that sentence. I'm sorry. This allows for us to elude the irrationality of anonymous being, of the there is, but also the challenge of the face of the other pulls us out of the there is. I guess I should explain what the there is from him. There is the there is if you could imagine pure being. If you could imagine, if you think of Christian mysticism, for example, Meister Eckhart, and you imagine the desert that he talks about, in which things just are what they are. And there are no distinction between things because human beings posit that distinction. This is often regarded as the apex of the mystical quest. For Levinas, it's actually sort of like hell. Because everything loses its meaning. Nothing in particular has a meaning. And that we move away from it through our relationship with others, but even before that, through an attempt to create a kind of meaning in the world through objects, through tools, and things like that. Okay, so emerging from meaningless, from a brute being, the there is, the self is separated from anonymity through the enjoyment of existing, bathing, in constant experience, in eating, drinking, sitting in the sun, in labor. To project enjoyment, we create dwellings against the elements in an effort to ensure the continued enjoyment of the things we possess. For Sartre, the human condition, on the other hand, is characterized by what he calls the desire to be God. This is not only expressed in the effort to create the in itself for itself, to unite fixity and transcendence in an impossible identity, to achieve the impossible goal of being capable of both change and permanent perfection. The desire to be God is also always related to brute existence, which is the current object of desire. We desire to possess an object, to make it personal, to make it ours. This object may be a bit of bread, a weapon, an automobile, the meaning of a cultural object, or even another human being. The object of desire does not even have to be a concrete object. Even an object that exists obscurely and that has not yet been realized is still an object for desire. For example, when an artist wishes to create a work of art, when a critic or thinker interprets a text. Sartre maintains that the desire to create is reducible to the desire to possess, and thus the desire to be God. And we'll go on and I'll explain what the desire to be God is in a lot clearer ways than I've been explaining it so far in a minute. If I create a painting, it is because I wish to be the origin of its concrete existence. Its existence only interests me in the measure that I have created it, and the link of creation that I have established gives me the right of property upon my creation. Through it, I've justified my own existence. It is not simply that something is brought to exist. It is brought to exist by me. Just as God has a right of property on his creation, I have a right over what I have made. It is mine and of me. The object owes its existence to me. Because the object exists by my act, my existence gains a type of necessity that it did not have before. I am the necessary being for the object that I have created. God is a projection of my own desire, so God's act of creation is the supreme example of possession, because God has not only created the individual object, but the material that it was made from. So the object is absolutely dependent on God for its being. This is what we wanted. This would be the ultimate human fantasy. God is the symbol of the fulfillment of the human desire, for God possesses his creation completely, and his existence is necessary for the existence of all creations. Possession, and thus personal objects, are both a substitution and a defense against the other. It prevents the deterioration of my world before the other's efforts to recreate the world in his image. In the act of possession, I attempt to delineate my world, to create it in such a way that the other cannot reinterpret it for me. The possession is mine already. The relationship is pre-established. By and for me, it may not be altered by the presence of the other. What I hope to do in this paper is delineate some of the similarities and differences between Levinas's and Sartre's approaches to possession and to personal objects, and how the relation to the object does not constitute the otherness of the other, or what Levinas will call the otherness of the face. Okay, so the first section, and I'm going to talk most of this now, so it will be a little less confusing. Okay, a little less. But the first section is on Sartre, Cartesian freedom, the desire to be God, and the awareness of infinity. Okay, so take a look over here. This is really famous stuff from Sartre. We get this in the Ontology of Being and Nothingness. And interestingly enough, this has very little to do with Sartre's phenomenological analysis in Being and Nothingness. He gets to this by using the ontological argument for the existence of God in a really fascinating and creative way. So we've got these three types of being. Being in itself. It is what it is. Okay? Being for itself, that's actually us. We both are and are not what we are. And that's the meaning of the title of the book, Being and Nothingness. You are both being and nothingness, okay, for Sartre. Whereas being in itself is pure being. It is what it is. And the last one is being in and for itself. Now, Sartre is using these remarkably like Heidegger, not like Heidegger, like Hegel does, right? Being in itself that becomes for itself, and then at the end you get being in and for itself. So being in and for itself is God, okay? Now, Sartre's going to say that's a magical being because it can't exist, can't possibly exist, and I'll explain why. So he's going to use, but we're going to see, he's going to use the ontological argument to prove that there can be no God, which would bother somebody like Descartes or St. Anselm, who created it up. But that's what we all want to be. We want to be this God. So let's go back to just this idea of being in itself for the first moment. In a weird way, Sartre is an Augustinian. Okay, St. Augustine. You wouldn't think of this, but he's borrowing certain things from theology that and using them in ways that theologians wouldn't think of. For example, God is what he is. God's in eternity. God is perfect. God doesn't need to change. But for Sartre, and he's getting to this kind of via Husserl and via the idea of intentionality, to be such a being would mean you would have to not be conscious, if you can see that. Because To be conscious is to be conscious of something of which you are not. It's to notice that there is a lack that wants to be fulfilled. This is where he's going to get some of his best lines, by the way. And if you know anything about Sartre is a gifted writer, as he's the only guy to turn down the Nobel Prize in Literature. And Sartre also can't resist a good line. And so when he says hell is other people, it's such a good line, even though he doesn't really mean it. It's, you just can't not use it. We're going to have man as a useless passion, which is just a wonderful line. But it's not quite what he means, but still, it's just so good he couldn't resist it. Anyway, so the in itself is what he characterizes as being. There's a great similarity here to what Levinas calls the there is that I tried to characterize for you before. But the way to think about the there is, and I think this is a good way to think about being in itself too, is how many of you have ever had insomnia? Where distinctions just kind of fall away. I used to be an insomniac. That's how I got into doing stuff on film, because I would watch movies late at night. This is before VHS and such, and you just see what was on. But there comes to be a point where you can't even do that anymore. You can't concentrate on a movie where you just sort of surf, because nothing stands out anymore. For Sartre, the idea of the in itself is close to that. It is pure being without differentiation. Okay? Think of, like I say, Meister Eckhart, or think of certain Buddhist ideas of once everything falls away. And so you get this kind of strange thing in Sartre that this is not ultimate enlightenment, you've entered hell. And that's certainly the way Levinas is going to look at it. Okay, so the second one, being for itself. This is, he borrows this, there's a tremendous influence on Sartre of Bergson and ideas of time as duration. Because what it is to be a human being is to both to be and not to be what you are. Reason for that is time. You are in time. You are constantly changing. Now, we develop projects in order to become something. I always think of Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront. When he's talking to Rod Steiger and he says, I could have been somebody. I could have been a contender. Except what am I? I'm a bum. Okay, so there's such an idea of I could have been something. I could have become God. Or even better for Sartre, it's Dostoevsky's Underground Man. When he says, what are you? You're a sluggard. Well, sluggard, that would at least be something. That's a vocation. That's something. It's really got class. But I'm not even a sluggard, because I have this possibility of constant change. So the third thing, the be in and for itself, which he says is a magical being that cannot possibly exist, is what he calls God. And that is to be perfect, changeless, and then capable of change. And so Sartre is aiming at the idea in Christian tradition that God is a personal being. How does God talk to Moses and yet be eternal at the same time? Isn't God modified by Moses? And certainly in the Bible he is. There's that wonderful passage when God gets mad at Israel and tells Moses, I'm going to destroy them all and I'll create you a new people. And Moses looks up and says, what are the Egyptians going to say? And God goes, yeah, I can see your point. Okay, I won't do it. Okay. But in traditional Christian theology, that possibility just kind of falls out. But we all want to be God. We want to be something. Let me read a wonderful passage. Just one of the most famous passages from Being and Nothingness. It comes at the end. Each human reality is at the same time a direct project to metamorphose its own for itself into an in and for itself, a project of the appropriation of the world as a totality of being in itself, in the form of a fundamental quality, Every human reality is a passion, in that it projects losing itself so as to found being at the same stroke to constitute the in itself which escapes contingency. To be human is to be contingent, to have all these possibilities before you that might not be realized. By being its own foundation, the ens causa sui, which religions call God. Thus the passion of man is the reverse that of Christ. For man loses himself in order that God may be born. So, here in Christ, the kenotic moment is Christ comes down as God and becomes man, whereas human beings lose themselves in order that God may be born. But the idea of God is contradictory, and then we lose ourselves in vain. Man is a useless passion. Okay. Now, Simone de Beauvoir is going to pick up on this in The Ethics of Ambiguity and say, yeah, we're a useless passion, but we are a passion. We are trying to do something. We're going to fail, but we are trying to do something. Now, let's go to the good, the bad, and the ugly, just for that one moment. That wonderful spaghetti western. If you remember, and this can be true of James Bond movies too, if you want to think of it that way. You have Eli Wallach, Lee Van Cleef, and Clint Eastwood all standing there, triple standoff. And this is how the idea, Sartre uses this notion, really famous notion of bad faith as well. In order for this movie to work, I'm talking about us for a minute, and then I'll use it again to talk about hell is other people and the desire to be God. But in order for this movie to work, we have to deceive ourselves, just like we do in this magical moment here. We have to think that Clint Eastwood can actually die. And this is true of most movies. You think of any rom-com you've ever seen. You had to think that Roberts, so what's her first name? Julia Roberts actually will not marry Hugh Grant or whoever it is. Okay, so but we have to think that Clint Eastwood can die, and at the same time we have to know that Clint Eastwood is God, and so he will not die, and he will, pop off Lee Van Cleef and knock him right into that grave, and then he will, take the money and go. So there's this magical moment here where we want God to be both in itself and contingent at the same time, which, as Sartre says, is a useless passion. It doesn't work. Now, this is also going to be related to the notion that hell is other people. Okay, so let me, both Levinas and Sartre are interested in Descartes. They're French. They have to be. And for Sartre, we encounter the idea of, there's two ideas we encounter from Descartes in him. One is this use of the ontological argument that I just described. This ontological argument is created by Anselm, but he's really using Descartes' version. The other is he's concerned with Descartes' notion of other minds. That we doubt the existence of other minds. Okay, so think of it this way. You can imagine Descartes describes this in the Meditations, and I'm sitting upstairs, I'm looking out at people walking down the street, and how do I know this? I don't know this with certainty. It could be that they are incredible automatons that are there, and they confuse me. Now, this is not for Sartre, this is not an existential doubt. Of course, not Levinas, but Descartes playing a game. Now, Sartre, though, says the otherness of the other, and we're going to run up against this again in Levinas, is actually something we can't doubt. We have an immediate awareness of it. He's going to use some famous examples to describe this. It can't be proved, but we also can't doubt it. Okay, so let me just give you a couple of his examples. We get to it through a couple of things. One of them is he calls a privileged emotion like shame. Okay, now the famous example he uses is looking through a keyhole. Okay, And you probably had an experience like this, where you're doing something you shouldn't do, and you're absorbed in your object out there. And this relates to certain things that he said in his book, The Transcendence of the Ego, and other places, but you're absorbed in the object you're looking at. Then all of a sudden you hear footsteps. And the object you're looking at is no longer what you're absorbed in. You're absorbed in the hair on your back of your neck goes up. You know you've been caught. Okay? You're aware of another who's there looking at you. So this is no longer the object. You're the object. Okay? And then that's what shame is. You're aware of yourself as an object for another. Or what I do with my students when I talk about this is I always ask them to see if they can repeat a line from the Beastie Boys. You remember the Beastie Boys?
You gotta fight for your right to party.
Yeah, that's true, but living at home is such a drag. Anybody finish it for me? Mom threw away my best porno mag. Okay, now this was a rite of passage for adolescents at a certain point. They always seem to have hidden their Playboy in between the mattress and the box spring. So parents always knew where to look for it. So we have this moment where the adolescent is objectified by his parent. Having done this to my son, I know about it. You pull it out and you say, "You little perv, what are you doing?" Okay, so.
You said that to your son?
Not really, but okay. Now think of this. Now here's where we're going to get hell is other people too. The little perv, my son Jimmy. No, he's a great little kid, but
He's 40.
well, he was 12 at the time. He looks back at me and calls me a Nazi.
Yeah, Jimmy would do that.
You fascist. Don't I have any privacy? So if you notice what's happened here is I have turned him into an object, little perv. His immediate reaction is to turn me into an object, old fascist. Okay, and what Sartre's playing with is this is a kind of immediate awareness of this kind of back and forth, where we turn the other into an object, and the other turns us into an object. And if you want a really great experience of this, Sartre describes it as an experience of being in a park, but I've had this experience I don't know how many times out hiking. You're in nature. Nature is yours. Then some other human being, they may be completely wonderful, but there's a moment there when you think, this asshole just robbed nature from me. He's coming down from the other side of the trail, and there he is. And it's this, so this idea of hell is other people. I'm going to skip all sorts of stuff in here and just read the end. But this idea that hell is other people comes out of this notion that they interfere in my desire to be God, in my desire to possess the world and make it my own. Like I remember when I got into the philosophy gig, I was going to become, I don't know. I remember this was at the University of Utah. I took an epistemology class, and I imagined myself becoming the great philosopher, and I got my midterm, and I had a C-. And it's, all of a sudden, my world had been destroyed.
No, he was wrong.
No, he was right. It was a really bad test. But my fantasy went away, and I got to it in other directions. But still, but this is the world we live in, according to Sartre. But the idea that we're a passion, you're trying to create a meaning within this world with others. Sartre's interesting here because too and this is why hell is other people. So think of that once again. Go back to the film. What are they all aiming for? There's a bunch of money in there that they want. They are projecting what they want to be in the future.
Don't you think that scene transcends the money?
Yes, of course it transcends the money, but still, it's the idea of being the ultimate badass.
Yeah.
And the money,
now you're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
The money's just the
money's part of
outer
it.
decoration.
Yeah, because ultimate badasses win the money. And so Clint Eastwood faces off with Eli Wallach and Lee Van Cleef. And of course, the reason, the one part where this fails is that Clint Eastwood does triumph and goes
Well, it's
off.
because he took Tuco's bullets.
Yeah. But I mean, still, and we watch it and we think, we all identify with Clint Eastwood, because we want to be God.
I don't.
But that only,
If I with Tuco.
okay, you can identify with Tuco. But that's the desire to be God. None of us identifies with Lee Van Cleef.
No, he's evil.
And he's also dead.
Yeah, he has to die.
Okay, so let me move.
If you're going to use that example, you have to finish it with when he's killed Lee Van Cleef. He looks at Tuco, whose bullets he's taken, and it wasn't really a Mexican standoff.
Yeah.
Because Clint Eastwood knew that Eli Wallach had
no bullets.
I mean, that's so not fair. Quentin Tarantino has been trying to correct that in every movie he made. But everybody at least has bullets. But anyway, he looks at him and he says, "There are two
kinds of people in the
this
world.
those with loaded guns
and those who dig."
So, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so it's important to remember, though, that Sartre called being a nothingness, this big book where I've been talking about hell is other people and all that thing, as the eidetics of bad faith. The book is about bad faith. It's about what it is not to be a human being in the proper way. And then he promises us his next book on ethics, which he never finishes. Actually, Simone de Beauvoir writes it for him in The Ethics of Ambiguity. But he has this giant, thick notebooks for an ethics that wasn't published until after he died.
Yeah.
Now, this is where Levinas and Sartre are actually quite close. And they both, interestingly, use the notion of infinity from Descartes' Meditations. But Levinas uses it in a way different than Sartre will.
Sartre will?
Than Sartre did.
That's a different
Not Crispin Sartwell. Okay. So Levinas, one of his most important books, of course, people know Totality, Infinity, and Otherwise in Being, but one of his most important books, the title is really significant, The God Who Comes to Mind. Okay, where does God come from? And for Levinas, we have the same situation that we have in Sartre, that I have this immediate awareness of the other person. But it's through that awareness of the other person that God actually comes to mind. The other, I am passive before the other in the same sense that I was passive before the person who's walking down the hall and sees me looking through the keyhole. It's the other that inquires of me. But Levinas turns this in a different way. For Sartre, he wants to say, in talking about us as being for itself, this combination of being and nothingness, which is the foundation of my freedom. For Levinas, it's that the other puts the ball in my park, and my freedom is activated. I am not free until the other person questions me. And their questioning doesn't have to be verbal. It can just be that their face is there. And I have to respond. Okay? So for both objects, though, for both Sartre and Levinas, objects become ways that I defend myself against other people. Think of Eliade here. Let's see, yeah. Sartre says the idea of property gets its meaning as something that belongs to or is part of the person who owns it. Sartre uses the French phrase for possession, être à, to be to, which has no English equivalent and which literally means to be to the person who possesses it. In other words, the possession, appropriated by the person, becomes a part of his being. So you can see possessions as becoming kind of a wall. You own these things, they're mine, they're not yours. Okay? In other words, possession is appropriated by the person, becomes a part of his being. This represents a union of the in itself and the for itself, of the object with me. It solidifies. Looking for an example, Sartre appeals to the phenomenology of religion and the conception of mana. He cites Eliada's description of burial rites in primitive societies. A man's personal goods are buried with him, or his wife is entombed or thrown on a pyre with him. Okay, you reduce the other to a thing. Sartre explains that the positivist explanation that he may have them in order to use them in the next world is inadequate to explain what is going on in the burial ritual. The object was a possession and hence a part of the departed person and had to be buried with him because it possesses his being. In this same sense, I try to meet the possessor through the objects that he has possessed to make his presence somehow permanent for me. Stuff, that we were talking about giving things away to each other. I visit a museum dedicated to a great person in the past and behold the articles that belong to her. Through them, I meet the person and remember her and perpetuate her being. But, for Sartre, these are kind of largely negative things. Possession is an attempt to overcome the exteriorization of objects, to establish a subjective link between the object and me, to have the object maintain its exteriority. The mind is seen as an intermediary relation between the absolute interiority of the me and the absolute exteriority of the not me. To possess something, then, is to appropriate it, to have it created for me. Therefore, Sartre asserts that to have is, in the first place, to create. The link between myself and the objects are links that I have created, and they must constantly be reestablished, continually created anew. The meaning of possession entails, in the same upsurge of activity, the object be identified with me and yet totally separate from me. So you can see this is kind of a bad faith move in itself. The object possessed, inasmuch as it is possessed by a person, is a continuous creation, but the in itself, the object, is also a brute existence. Its character is an in itself. This is especially made manifest in tools. Sartre uses the example of a pen. It is entirely mine. I do not even distinguish it from me in my act of writing. This is my act. But the action does not modify the character of the pen. I own it. But in itself, the pen is not modified by my ownership because in a realist sense, it is only an ideal relationship between myself and the pen. The possession of the object is the link between myself and the in itself. But it also reveals a point where possession as a manifestation of the desire to be God fails. I can enjoy my property only in the sense that I am not aware of it, that I use it as a tool, but the moment I become aware of it, it's no longer a tool. It's an object that resists me. Let me just end with a few pages just on Levinas and possessions here. The separation, a dwelling of the eye in separation and dwelling. So we have this idea that for Levinas we enjoy things, and we create dwellings to protect our enjoyment. The I stands out from the meaninglessness of being, of the there is. For Levinas, the sheer isness is not the self-giving Heidegger calls the escaped, but rather the meaninglessness of the bruteness of being. The dwelling is the essence of egoism. I build a retreat, a sanctuary from the world. It defends me against the anonymous horror of the non-I, of the element, what Levinas refers to as the there is. It is not a question of being thrown into a situation, but rather the pure enjoyment of the elemental nature of existence, of eating, being warm, sleeping. Those are the ways that I make this mine, and then I try and create a space in which it can continue to be mine. It's not simply that we have not chosen our birth, as it is with Heidegger. Our enjoyment is endangered by the very element that we enjoy. Think of nature. Enjoyment remains a chance, a stroke of luck. Dwelling is my attempt to preserve that luck. The dwelling in possession breaks the plenum of the element so that the I might recollect itself and its labor to possess its surrounding, to make it its property. The dwelling breaks the plenum of the element. It opens a utopia in which the I recollects itself and is at home. It's important here to remember that utopia means no place. It makes labor and property possible. The element is fixed for a time in the four walls, but as with Sartre, this is only a temporary respite. We are challenged by both the element itself and by the other who wants to either take it from me or asks me to share it with him. The unforeseeable future can and will change this. This is a radical contingency in living. It's luck. The uncertain future of the element is suspended. The element is fixed between the four walls of the home and called a possession. It appears there as a thing which can perhaps be defined by tranquility, as in a still life. The grasp operated on the element is labor. The unforeseeable is such that its origin in the there is indefinite. But this is a bad infinite, a meaningless one. It lacks any meaning that is given to it by the relation to another. As with Sartre, possession gives us a respite, a sense of permanence, but it is certainly not the solution to meaninglessness. It is not primarily a protection against the other, though this is possible. It protects the subject against the elemental itself, which is understood in a somewhat different sense than the in itself of Sartre. It would be incorrect to say the elemental is pure positivity. It is not shown to be there, though the use of the ontological proof, as ontological proof as Sartre does in Being and Nothingness. Levinas rather approaches it through a phenomenological analysis and describes it as a kind of anonymous being in general, devoid of definition and distinction. The closest encounter of it being the experience of insomnia, which we talked about before. It is impersonal and anonymous. It has no personal form. Rather, it is being in general beyond inwardness and exteriority. The impersonal, anonymous, yet inextinguishable consumption of being, which murmurs in the depths, this is actually a quote from Levinas, of nothingness itself, we shall designate by the term there is. The there is, inasmuch as it resists personal form, is being in general. We have not derived this notion from exterior things or the inner world of any being whatsoever. The there is transcends inwardness as well as exteriority. It does not make it possible to distinguish between these. Okay, end quote. The there is a state without any particular beings. It is devoid of any indicators or demarcations. It is a no thing rather than a nothing. It is utterly impersonal, and it is against this impersonal force that the hypostatic act rebels, the human being attempting to set up a dwelling in nature. This is not against the other, since the existing of the in itself, which is already peace, is precisely the absence of all self. It is without a self, sans soi. The individual emerges from this totality, this no-thingness, through an act and through use and enjoyment of the elements of the world. He establishes himself through labor and dwelling. Dwelling in possession establishes the self in the elemental and allows temporality. Allows it to temporarily protect itself against the enjoyments of the uncertainty of life. I'm going to skip some. I'm sorry, I've got way too much here. Unlike Heidegger, Levinas argues that labor in its primary attention is this acquisition, this movement toward oneself, but it is not a transcendence. This separation, this surging up from the elemental, is not yet transcendence as it would be for Sartre or for Bergson or for Heidegger. This would make transcendence creativity. It would use the aesthetic as the primary sense of transcendence, and make that that kind of creativity the escape from the bad infinity of the Ilia. What it does, however, is to still the anonymous wrestling of the there is. It gives a kind of sense to it. You can think of this as the Sartrean passion or the Sartrean project. Okay, yeah. Element yields to labor. It is shaped by labor. It stills the controllable stirring of the there is for a time, but it is not what Levinas is going to call the face-to-face. The effort of the craftsperson, laborer, or artist to give meaning to the anonymous wrestling of the there is does not free us from the there is, but only stills it. We imprint on it. It is ours only temporarily. The personification of the object is yet another example of this. One works with the stubborn opposition of the object, but this is not the infinity of others, of the face-to-face. Notice the similarity here between the kind of work done by the slave in Hegel's Master Slave and is later picked up by Marx. The slave sees himself in the product of his labor. We have an aesthetic solution to the problem of the elemental and the bad infinite. Meaning does seem to appear here, but we have not yet arrived at what Levinas wants to call transcendence. Creativity, labor, work, etc. is still the self playing with itself. Okay, think of this in theological terms. Teddy bears. So you make your own teddy bear. Okay, how many? You've all had teddy bears?
Build a bear.
You all had teddy bears? When did they stop working? Think of it, Ralph having.
They don't work.
Yeah, Ralph has, say Ralph has a teddy bear when he was a little kid. And this is not the movie Ted, okay? But there's a certain point, there's a point when the teddy bear works. I keep thinking of Mr. Rogers singing that song, sometimes I hold my teddy bear tightly all night long. He's old, but he's still strong. There's a certain point when your teddy bear looks at you and tells you, Ralph, I love you, where you realize that you're only talking to yourself. Okay, that you're making your teddy bear speak to you. Tom Hanks Wilson, if you remember from
The volleyball.
Yeah.
Wilson.
Yeah, Wilson.
Wilson is not a volleyball.
It's a basketball.
No, Wilson's a volleyball.
Oh, it is a volleyball, but
It's
it's
volleyball.
not. Wilson is distinct
Wilson
from
is
the volleyball.
Wilson is a person.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Wilson is a
no.
handprint.
It fails to be another person, even though he has imprinted the face of the basketball with his own blood.
It's a volleyball.
I thought it was a basketball.
It's a volleyball.
It's a soccer ball. Oh, we can have this argument. That's good. Hell is other people. Aesthetic and academic creations are not others. Pirandello's characters take on a life of their own, but they're still Pirandello's. Sartre correctly claims in Existentialism as a Humanism that God can have no other because he creates them as penknives. If God creates everything ex nihilo and the other brings nothing to God, then God has no other. This is the frustration of human relations for Sartre. In love, for example, I want to possess the freedom of the other, but at the same time, I want to control them as if they were an inflatable sex doll. As Levinas writes, the laborer will subjugate it if it does not oppose frontally, but as already abdicating to the hand which seeks its vulnerable point, which already ruse and industry reaches for it obliquely. Levinas is not very clear sometimes. None of this stops me. Possession removes being from change. Possession grants me a rest and ultimately the illusion that I have stepped out of the Heraclitean river of life. And yet, things are always phenomenal. What makes them something in relation to me, possession refers me to profound metaphysical relations. Possession by its nature refers to others. Levinas writes really interesting stuff on money. Money can't exist unless there are others out there that I have to deal with. As Levinas writes, a thing does not resist acquisition. The other possessors, those who one cannot possess, contest and therefore sanction possession itself. But the other person, is already present in all of this. War, raiding, theft, exchange, barter, and money enter the picture. It is always in relation to another. Thus, the possession of things issues in a discourse. The action that is beyond labor, presupposing the absolute resistance of the face of another being, is command and word, or the violence of murder. The irony is, already there is nothing about your relation to your possession that is yours. The other is always already there. You don't have possessions in the first place without it, the other. Possession refers to the other. Personal objects exist in relation between persons, in relation to others. We are social. We enter into complex relations that include cultural objects that help make us a person. This is nowhere more clearly the case than in books. Our books, our stories give us context and relate us to those who have gone before. I'll end with a quote from Levinas on this. All humanity has books, but they have books before books. The inspired language of proverbs, fables, and folklore. The human being is not only in the world, not only, this is his critique of Heidegger, in der Welt sein, but also zum Buch sein, being toward the book. In relationship to the inspired word, the ambience as important for our existence as streets, houses, and clothing. The book wrongly interpreted as pure Zuhandens, ready to hand, as that which is at hand, a manual. My relation to the book is definitely not pure use. It doesn't have the same meaning as the one I have with a hammer or a telephone.
I'll raise a complaint.
What?
Most mature people I know just are not so hung up on possession. Because it leads to nothing but frustration
It's
anyway.
9/10 of the law.
Yeah, nine points of the law. But the thing about it is mature people overcome this. Mm. I mean, you don't really ever possess anything, nor does anything wholly possess you. It's just common sense to a person who has grown up. Because anything you have, you can lose, and you learn that. And anything that has you can lose you, and you learn that. Mm-hmm. And then this whole thing is over, and you don't worry about it anymore. I mean, there's no point in working it to this degree. Personhood doesn't depend on this dialectic.
Well, possession means much more than...
Are those yours?
We can share.
You know, anything you have, you
Okay.
could lose. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, but possession means more than just things. In here, this paper is because we're writing about personal objects. We're writing about things. Of course, possession can be a reputation, how you see yourself in the world. It's the desire to control the story.
Now I'm getting it. But to me, it's like another person you could never own anyway. And that would be the same thing for an object that has this kind of personal value. But now you're saying something that I didn't hear in the paper. Wanting to control the narrative, I completely understand. I think even mature people still want to control the narrative, at least where it begins to touch on those Mexican standoffs, where other people's interpretations might unseat mine.
Yeah,
right?
Possession of things is a kind of rudimentary form for both of these people. On that second one, how you control the narrative. The title of Levinas's main book is Totality and Infinity. Totality is a narrative that would be completely controlled. It's interesting that the title of the book, Totality and Infinity, remember he's Lithuanian, he came to philosophy first through Russian literature. Totality and Infinity is War and Peace. If I realize, the war is the effort to control the narrative in a certain way. This is why he says politics is constant war. But infinity would be the recognition of the infinity of the other, that I can't control them. That's beyond anything I can really do. There's a wonderful Dave Chappelle skit from back in the golden age of the Chappelle Show, where, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm going to use a really terrible word here, but it's always these guys, oh, so-and-so's really fucked up. And at one point, it's Dave Chappelle, as you go back through history, Dave Chappelle as a slave. And he goes, boy, Lincoln's really fucking up. He's reading the newspaper, and then all of a sudden it's the master, and he goes, because he has to play this part. But the fact that, and this is what's wonderful in Master Slave, the fact is even the master, he has to live in a fantasy to think that he's completely controlled his slaves. There are always the stories that they're telling, there's always all this stuff that they're doing that's undermining the power of the master. But it's that idea, possession, the reason the master, amasses the enormous estate, that he buys people, is he wants to control the story. He wants to be a big man.
Okay, I never thought of that before. I'm going to have to think about that. Other people.
So, for an object or a place or even another human being to be personal, that's always against the hypothetical other. That's always like this war of all against all.
Well, there is a sense, where if we could look at, and this is where I was going over this again today and thinking my problem is I always find that I agree with Randy more than I originally thought I did. That I come, at the end when we're talking about, when he was talking about the book, I come to be a person in part through these kind of cultural objects.
Right.
Now, he would never say that these are persons, as opposed to you.
Sartre or Randy?
No,
Levinas would never say these are persons.
Sartre certainly wouldn't say it.
Yeah, Sartre wouldn't say it, but Levinas, but he says I become personal through these.
They're
because
personalizing.
Yeah, because these are, in a way, these are where the ancestors or the others are speaking to me.
Yeah.
I'm tying into a tradition here, into a narrative of in the positive sense of thousands of people, even money. He has this wonderful analysis of money that we don't usually think of this way, but money does this. Money is a way I relate to other people, and it's better than certain other ways of doing it.
So, but even in this case, objects that we experience are personal. It's just egotism, right? Like the teddy bear is really just me speaking, and the book is really just for me, for my own development.
The teddy bear, certainly. Though I could imagine cases where the teddy bear, if I were to give it to my child.
Yeah. I mean, does this 2-year-old knit themselves a teddy bear? No one in the community gave them the teddy bear? No, their parents?
Yeah. But I mean, let me give you a negative example. I had a fight with my sister in which I left a scar on her face because I grabbed her teddy bear under the Christmas tree because it would complete my set: Mama Bear, Papa Bear, and Baby Bear. Okay, so it was this.
You were doomed. You needed a set.
Yeah, I needed a set.
Okay.
Okay, but in that sense, yeah, there is the child isn't thinking of where he gets this and how it relates to the other. Hopefully, as Randy said, when you grow up, you'll grow out of that.
Yeah, I mean, because this extends out of that conversation that we were having last time, right? Is this idea of, because I kind of like the existential phenomenological standpoint too, which is starts at the individual, right? And then you have this question of, okay, well, wherein does the community, where does the other person fit in? Are they just subservient to my narrative of becoming God? I mean, you can't read Schelling and Hegel and these guys without going like, oh, it's just everyone, we're becoming God, right? Like that's the absolute, that's the, like I'm both a human being and then I'm also divine, right? And there's this whole Christian idea behind it. And so, like, it's a strong consideration to have, is, okay, well, what is the role of the other, and is it just egotism that I reduce them to developing my humanity, and then that's the end of the story. I don't know if I have like a question that comes out of this, but it's...
Are you saying not everybody wants to be God? Some people are content to have others develop their personhood? Is that what
I
you're
don't know.
saying?
I'm not saying anything. I'm questioning, pondering.
Well, Sartre certainly believed. I think you're right. I don't. If you read Being and Nothingness, it is discouraging.
Yeah.
Because it does seem that that's what he's saying. But then when he comes out and says, "Well, I'm doing this so you will not be this way,"
yeah.
and he has this really.
Nah, he's doing it because he wants to.
Now he has this really kind of.
I'm a Pelagian at heart. When it gets right down to it,
But
yes,
John-
he's sinning
John,
against
how can
all
he
history.
Say that when he spent the whole book arguing that this is an ontologically
Necessary, right?
Characterization of what it means to be
Well, he's
a
Augustinian, right?
conscious being.
We're all
We're
fallen.
sinned. We're fallen.
Well,
I mean,
that's why I'm a
it's
Pelagian.
ontologically
He did that because he
necessary.
wanted to.
Yeah.
Not just a description of how we ought not to be. And
Yeah,
what
he's-
going to do how we ought to
I
be in a later book. This is
what we are.
We're
This is
doomed
an
to.
Well, that's why
ontologically necessary
Condemned to
thing
be
about
free.
us.
That's where he gets stuck. You're right. That's why the other second book never comes out.
And also, Simone de
And-
Beauvoir's book came out long before Sartre died.
Yeah.
So, I mean, she wasn't just doing what he should have been doing. She did something he couldn't do
Yeah.
because her worldview wasn't as despairing as his. When she said, it's not a problem that man is a useless passion, she didn't mean, well, at least we have a passion, but of course we're going to fail. She meant we shouldn't be judging people on whether they are useful, because useful means useful toward
Yeah.
some other end, whereas the
Well,
conscious creature
okay,
is
okay.
the end.
Well, but
It's the only
both of
one that can be.
them, agree, and this is when he comes out with existentialism as a humanism, and what is literature, which happens about the same time as ethics of ambiguity, that the goal that we can have is that others be able to realize their freedom, which is what she pretty well says in Ethics of Ambiguity. But you're right. I agree with you that Sartre gets stuck in this kind of what really messes him up is he gets stuck in this kind of Augustinian ontology of the in itself and the for itself. If he hadn't gone that way, you wouldn't have the kind of analysis that you get in Being and Nothingness, that ends with the idea that a person is a useless passion. Now, he's already kind of, even in Being and Nothingness, sort of moved away, because you know how philosophical books are. You don't achieve what you wanted to achieve, really. But when he introduces being for others, he's already kind of put a crack in his the way he set up the ontology of the in itself and for itself. Yeah, I think there's at the end of his career, in the part that is the most that when he and Simone de Beauvoir have a bit of a falling out at the end of it, not the end of his career, the end of his life. And he has this relationship to Benny Levy, and they come out with the little book Hope Now. He does move to kind of a Levinasian position in that book. And that he was, and Simone de Beauvoir accused Benny Levy of manipulating him at that point. But I think that that might have been a natural way for him to move, given what he had already done when talking about being for others and being in nothingness.
So, you personally, do you think that it's impossible to be in and for oneself?
Mm-hmm.
You do.
But I think it's a bad idea to set it up that way in the first place.
What else? How would we set it
What
up?
else is there?
So basically, Sartre is saying, all right, here's Hegel. The absolute is nonsense, right? Basically.
No. Okay. Yeah. Well.
So
one of the things.
What else do we do then?
No, but Sartre in Being in Nothingness. Excuse me, I'm sitting on this in some weird way. Isn't Hegelian enough?
Well, clearly he can't follow Hegel.
No, but one of the funny things about Sartre is just historically, in the Schilp volume that you were involved with, the Library of the Living Philosophers. He's asked, because he has this being in itself, being for itself, being in it for itself. And he's asked about his relation to Hegel. And he says, well, when I wrote Being in Nothingness, I'd never read Hegel. And the person is just shocked. What seems to have happened was that, and he didn't go to all the lectures, but I don't believe him when he says that. I believe he did read Hegel.
You read Kojev.
Yeah,
Everybody read Kojev.
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking about, the lectures.
Yeah.
Simone de Beauvoir went to the lectures. We're not sure Sartre did.
Yeah.
But so what gets set up in the lectures is the phenomenology of spirit as the master-slave relationship. And that runs all the way through Being in Nothingness. Klaus Hartmann wrote a really interesting book on Sartre's ontology. And the problem, I think, with Sartre in Being in Nothingness is his ontology is too much like Augustine, where you have being in itself, which is pretty well the way Augustine talks about God, pure positivity. Whereas Hegel never does that. Hegel's going back to a different kind of idea of being that he tries to do in the Logic, where being and nothing flow into each other, which actually goes back to people like Jakob Boehme. And the notion of notion of the Ungrund, which is a pure kind of possibility, which is actually quite close to what Levinas calls the there is, which is pure possibility, but it's nothing yet. But what's interesting about Simone de Beauvoir's use of the idea of passion in Sartre, and Sartre's use of passion, and Levinas is you have this kind of flip on what you do in the mystical tradition. Whereas the idea, if you look at somebody like Meister Eckhart, or in certain ways that people do Buddhism, is the idea is to come to the desert, to come to the place where you've gotten beyond all the distinctions. What Boehme does, and gets picked up by Schelling and Hegel and Berdyaev and a whole tradition of people after that, is, and by Levinas, is this is not where you want to go. This is what you want to escape from. Right. Because these finite beings are an improvement on that.
And Cassir's in that group too.
Okay. That's interesting because, when Levinas was a young man, you probably know this story, I don't know.
Oh, he was at the debate between Heidegger and
it's worse than that.
Heidegger and Cassir.
It's actually worse than that.
What?
So Heidegger, he's doing his doctoral work at the University of Strasbourg, not in Paris, and he gets invited to, he gets a fellowship and he goes to Freiburg and studies with Husserl and Heidegger, and he's absolutely mesmerized by Heidegger. As many were. And so they go to the Davos debate, and they have a play after the debate's over of the debate between Heidegger and Cassira. And Levinas, who has a great head of hair, like Cassira, gets flour, puts it in his hair, and he's
pretending to be Cassira.
He's pretending to be Cassira, and he is apparently quite disrespectful.
Yeah.
And he regrets this for the rest of his life. And so when he comes to the United States, he tries to visit Cassira's wife and apologize.
I didn't know that.
I think she knew it, and I think it shows up in her attitude towards Heidegger's followers. I think Levinas counted as one of the disrespectful young men
Yeah.
who were following around at his heels, repeating everything he said.
Yeah, and then
That's the way she describes them.
and this is what, when Heidegger becomes a Nazi, this is why Levinas writes his first book, kind of contra Heidegger, in 1935 or 36, called On Escape, where you want to being is not what you want to get to; it's what you want to escape from, and that's where ethics becomes eventually in Totality and Infinity becomes first philosophy, because his problem with Sartre would be that Sartre still is doing ontology.
Do you think that tradition comes more out of something like Boehme, or the noumenal in Kant, or both is basically
Both.
the answer, right?
Yeah, in Boehme you can go back to Isaac Luria and Kabbalistic tradition and find it there too.
Yeah.
But it's an idea that somehow the finite world is better. Or how did my professor, Jim Hart at Indiana? He's a Husserl guy.
I know the name.
I was wondering, because he's a Husserl,
Yeah.
you sort of a Husserl guy, aren't you?
Sort of.
Yeah. But the question he was always concerned with is God is God the world greater or not greater than God alone? And of course, for people with Luria and Boehme and all that, God plus the world is greater than God alone, and certainly with Hegel. Although with Hegel, it's not quite clear.
Although, at the end, it's just God being with himself.
Yeah.
In a complicated way, right?
Yeah, and that's what
Yeah.
Schelling really comes out
Yeah.
against in the Freedom essay. But yeah,
So, oh, sorry.
Well, as anybody else, we've
Yeah,
been,
before we keep just
Jim went quite a while.
yammering on.
I'm sorry, I yammered on for too long.
So what was the? Oh,
Well, the barbecue won't arrive for another 35 minutes, but
you
if
said.
you've got one more, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to ask a question before we just keep yammering on about German idealism?
Yeah.
Just a question, non-expert question. If you're perceiving something, and in that apprehension, is that possessing or joining with? I'm thinking kind of like Wallace Stevens, The Snowman, that poem.
Okay.
Is-
I don't know the poem. I'm sorry,
Okay.
but you could quote it, and I would love to hear it,
I'd have to.
or sort of quote it.
It's a poem about seeing the winter
Mm-hmm.
and being able to be the winter and seeing the nothing that is,
Mm-hmm.
and being that nothing yourself by seeing that.
Okay.
So, in other words, actually apprehending that reality,
Uh-huh.
and in so doing, is that possession or is that a joining with?
Okay. It's interesting. For both of these people, okay. Let me back off and say something about myself first, and then try and answer for Sartre and Levinas. Okay. For me, I one of the things I'm most fascinated with is mysticism. And I do write about it, and I teach it. But one of the things that disturbs me about it is the idea of because you have basically Steve Katz, who's a Jewish philosopher and does religious studies, writes a lot about mysticism, and his argument, one of the classic arguments by a lot of people is that mysticism is the universal religion. Okay, somebody like John Hick. And people who usually take that position, if you go back, you got people like Madame Blavatsky, doing this way back in the 19th century, usually are saying that the ultimate form of mysticism is what they call unitive mysticism, where you become one with whatever it is. You ever hear that old joke? The Zen Buddhist monk goes up to the make me one with everything. It's that, yeah. And so there's this sense of unitiveness that you get as well. The other one is called Dialogical Mysticism. And both of these have multiple forms. Dialogical mysticism is where you don't become one with everything else. There's a really great example of this in Hinduism, where you have Shankara as the champion of unitive mysticism, where I become one with someone else, with everything else, and Ramanuja is the antagonist to that, who says, well, if you're going to have love, you have to have a lover and a beloved, so it's got to be dialogical. The problem that somebody like Levinas would definitely be in the second camp, that you have to have that separation. And I think both Levinas and Sartre would see the first one as a kind of, that I become one with this, as kind of an illusion. You become one with this when you die. But until then, no. You're just taking a view of it and just kind of,
And you learn that as soon as somebody else comes along.
Yeah.
So you're looking at the winter scene for Wallace Stevens. If somebody else shows up, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
You're no longer. Perception is a kind of possession, I suspect, but it's an illusion to think that it's all yours.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possessed, but without becoming an absolute possession.
Is the
But-
moment yours, though?
That's a good question.
Well, that's what is interesting about the example that you use as well, is if I do the unitive thing, isn't part of this losing myself anyway? So that to say that this is mine would be the wrong thing to say. And that we.
But it's more than it is, right? So it's not Ilya.
Well, I think it is kind of Ilya, but it's kind of a positive take on that as opposed to Levinas's
Okay.
simply negative take on it. That you, and here what might be important too is the oscillation. Remember William James talking about mystical states says one of the first things he says about them is they're transient. You can't stay here forever. If you do, then it's over. Okay, it's noetic though. You know something, you learn something here. And in Stephen's poem, it would be you would learn the kind of ultimate unity that you have maybe with other things. And it would be wrong to say that this, I think, was mine. Because those moments, like when you think of when you're absorbed in a beautiful symphony. Part of the joy of it is the loss of the self, and not thinking that it's, that Mahler's Eighth Symphony is mine. I don't know.
I know we have to kind of end, but like, especially since you ended with the Mahler thing, something that I think is interesting, and I feel like this is a very modern thing, and it's getting more so with the rise of technology, but it seems to me, so you've got the unity and you've got the dialogic, right? These two classical ideas. But nowadays, I feel as if the thing that people want the most is aloneness together. A symphony is a perfect example. The other one that strikes me is the movie theater, right? But even the internet is like, so we're all reading this together, or memes, or this kind of cult, like we're all seeing this or reading this together, but also alone, right? That there's something slightly different about that compared to those two examples of you see the symphony is for you, but it's also for, like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, and so contrasting that is very interesting with that. I loved, by the way, that example that you gave of walking in, like, the hike. I think that's great. Like that feel, like, because that is, you feel that, and you're like, but then, so how do we get from there? And maybe this is an answer to that, or a potential answer to that problem of like, well, this is for me, but also we're all here together. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you go to I don't know. That seems like a very different phenomenological experience of being.
It wouldn't be
alone.
the same symphony if you were the only one sitting
Yeah, exactly.
there. Yeah.
Right, and we crave these things. We love these things nowadays. This is a very modern thing. It's like, yes, I want the individualism. I want it to be tailored for me, but I also like knowing that there are other people looking at it or hearing it or.
Well, you've made me want to rewrite my paper, which is good. But you probably don't want me to at this point. but something that I didn't talk about that I should have is, for Levinas, part of what's great about the fact that I run into the other person on the trail is that they have inconvenienced me.
Yeah, sure.
You know, think of Jesus telling the story of the Good Samaritan. You know, I have places to go. And by the way, if you really want to catch the real meaning of this, you have to see the grade BBB Canadian movie Jesus Christ Vampire Hunter, in which Jesus has just been assaulted by vampires. And a priest walks by, but he has to get somewhere. A cop walks by, but he's off duty. A transvestite walks by and says, "Oh, you poor dear." That gets you see that and you think, yeah, that's Jesus' story, because it's a Samaritan who walks by and sees this guy. But it's the idea that, yeah, isn't it great that we're inconvenienced by the other? Because that's going to be what actually is going to get us to stop Trump from strip mining Bears ears. It's the fact that we've got these other people who we're inconvenienced by, who can call us to kind of a community.
All right. I guess that's it, right?
Sure, yeah,
All right,
thanks.
applause.